Hi everyone. So this slideshow is focusing on the history of narrative journalism as well as defining narrative journalism. We're going to look at the different techniques narrative journalists use and the other contexts that surround the genre. Narrative journalists are creating more in-depth stories through their techniques. And those techniques or research methods are interviewing and observations. And they also use outside research when conducting and writing their stories. However, most of their content derives specifically from their observations and interviews that they conduct. They also use rhetorical devices, which we'll learn more about later, but these devices do help develop the content of the story. And their stories rely on the individual journalist interpretations of their research, so of their observations, and since the content of the stories is based upon those observations, narrative journalisms and other journalisms always have predispositions with their journalists. You will always bring in your own personal bias into your work, but it's important to know how to navigate that ethical consideration that is always present, especially in narrative journalism, because we use rhetorical devices in our stories. During their research, narrative journalists do use more time and such as days, weeks, studying their subjects in order to create a more well-rounded story. And they do this so that they can create a better relationship with their subject, so that they know more about the topic. Narrative journalism then has rhetorical devices, as I mentioned earlier, and originally they were used in the genres of creative fiction and creative nonfiction. However, narrative journalism does use rhetorical devices, which brings in those ethical considerations. Rhetorical devices should not be used to embellish or exaggerate in a content. We're not trying to manipulate audiences or spread lies about people's real experiences. Instead, we're simply trying to provide more in-depth detail and act as a voice for the individuals and their experiences so that they can be heard at a deeper level than that would typically seen in a news story. And some examples of rhetorical devices are theme, flashback, and epiphany, although there are a few others that we will be learning. Narrative journalism used to be referred to as new journalism, and this slideshow is just going to provide you some background information on what narrative journalism used to be. So back in the 1960s and 70s, the term new journalism was used to refer to as narrative journalism. This term was used previously before that, but this is when it kind of became more popular, when journalists began using rhetorical devices to create those same in-depth stories. And we have a quote here: "The purpose was to create articles on a larger scale that would have the credibility of fact, the immediacy of film, the depth and the freedom of prose, and the precision of poetry." So again, using those rhetorical devices, characterization, things that would typically be seen in creative writing, while still having ethical considerations to keep in mind because of those rhetorical devices. Two other kinds of narrative journalism that aren't necessarily narrative journalism specifically is muckraking and gonzo journalism. Muckraking is a little more specific to the time, as it says 1955 to 1975 during the Vietnam War specifically. And during this time, journalists were using narrative journalism tactics to investigate politicians for potential corruption within the government. Gonzo journalism, which is a lot more of a controversial form of narrative journalism. Lots of times journalists don't want to group the two together. However, gonzo journalism does use rhetorical devices in its writing. And the specific thing here is that gonzo journalism does manipulate in their writings, and it's usually to create an overall theme or message that it's trying to push onto the audiences. Lots of times it's been said that gonzo journalism is meshing both fact and fiction to create an interesting story for its audiences. Here are my references. If you have any more questions